I'm going to need to see that boarding pass again, miss. People like you sometimes get confused about which section they're supposed to be in. The sound wasn't a whisper. It was loud enough for half the first-class cabin to hear. The 17-year-old girl in seat 2A didn't flinch. Her fingers simply adjusted their grip on the NASA orientation packet in her lap, the Federal Eagle seal visible on the cover. Her voice, when it came, was steady as bedrock. What Richard Bauer didn't know, what none of them knew, was that in 18 hours, her father would be standing in federal court, presenting opening arguments in a discrimination case that could reshape aviation law forever. Have you ever walked into a room where you belonged, only to have someone decide you didn't? Where your presence was questioned not because of anything you'd done, but because of how you looked? Because what happened on that Monday morning flight from Atlanta to Washington Dulles was exactly that, and so much more. If you've never subscribed, now might be the time. These are the stories that don't make the evening news but absolutely should. Stories about what happens when assumption meets reality and reality wins. Now, let's go back to where this really began. 6 hours earlier, Zoe Williams was standing in her mother's kitchen, watching her pack a lunch that would never be eaten. "You don't have to make me anything, Mom. They'll have food on the plane." Zoe adjusted the strap of her NASA duffel bag, the same one she'd carried through 3 summer internships at Johnson Space Center. The bag was worn now, the red NASA logo faded from years of use, but she wouldn't trade it for anything newer. Her mother, Dr. Patricia Williams, didn't look up from the counter where she was wrapping sandwiches with the same precision she used in her neurosurgery practice. First-class passengers or not, airplane food is airplane food. Besides, you get nervous when you don't eat. It was true, Zoe had inherited her mother's metabolism and her father's tendency to forget meals when stressed. Today qualified as stressful. The NASA orientation packet lay open on the kitchen island, pages of schedules and housing assignments for the Goddard Space Flight Center fellowship she'd earned. At 17, she was the youngest person ever selected for the program. The achievement should have felt triumphant. Instead, it felt heavy. "Dad already left for court?" Zoe asked, though she knew the answer. Marcus Williams, federal prosecutor, never missed his Monday morning case prep, especially not for the discrimination case he'd been building for 8 months. "4:30 a.m., her mother said, finally looking up. "You know how he gets before big cases. He was downstairs reviewing depositions until midnight." She paused, studying Zoe's face. "He wanted to drive you to the airport himself." "The car service is fine." Zoe picked up her boarding pass, printed on heavy stock paper with first class embossed across the top. A graduation gift from her parents, though she'd argued it was unnecessary. They'd compromised on first class instead of the family jet. Sometimes having successful parents meant fights about things other kids couldn't imagine. The kitchen fell quiet except for the hum of the espresso machine and the distant sound of Atlanta traffic building toward rush hour. Their house in Buckhead sat on 2 acres, insulated from the noise, but morning still carried the energy of a city waking up. Zoe had lived here her entire life, in rooms filled with her mother's medical awards and her father's legal commendations. Success was the family currency, and she'd been earning it since elementary school. "Zoe," her mother's voice carried the tone that meant important conversation ahead. "This fellowship, are you sure it's what you want?" The question surprised her. Her parents had celebrated her acceptance to NASA with the same enthusiasm they'd shown for her early admission to MIT. Astrophysics wasn't the career path they'd imagined for their daughter, but they'd learned to trust her choices. "I've wanted this since I was 12, Mom." "That's not what I asked." Zoe set down her boarding pass and really looked at her mother. Patricia Williams had performed her first surgery at 28, published groundbreaking research on pediatric brain tumors, and raised a daughter while building a practice that drew patients from across the Southeast. She didn't ask casual questions. "I'm 17, Zoe said quietly. "I'll be living in Maryland, working with people who have PhDs and decades of experience. Most of them will look at me and see a kid playing dress-up in a lab coat. And sometimes I think they might be right." Her mother finished wrapping the sandwiches and walked around the island. She was still in her scrubs from the early morning surgery she'd completed before coming home to see Zoe off. At 45, Patricia Williams had the steady hands of a surgeon and the gentle touch of a mother. Right now, Zoe needed both. "Do you know what I was doing at 17? Her mother asked. Pre-med at Howard. I was failing organic chemistry and convinced I'd never be smart enough for medical school. Patricia smiled. I called my mother crying, ready to switch majors. You know what she told me? Zoe shook her head. She said the world is full of people who will tell you what you can't do. Your job is to prove them wrong, one day at a time. The car service honked outside, a subtle sound that still managed to feel urgent. Zoe shouldered her bag and grabbed the lunch her mother had prepared. Through the kitchen window, she could see the driver waiting beside a black sedan, checking his watch. The NASA people who selected you, her mother continued. They don't make mistakes. They chose you because you earned it, not because of your age, not despite it, because of your work. Zoe nodded, though the knot in her stomach remained. She'd been the youngest person in most rooms her entire life. Youngest in her high school graduating class, youngest intern at Johnson Space Center, youngest fellow in NASA's program. The achievement felt less like success and more like a target painted on her back. Your father will call you tonight after court, her mother said. Win or lose, he'll want to hear about your first day. He's going to win. Zoe said it with the certainty of someone who'd watched Marcus Williams prepare cases her entire life. Her father didn't just practice law, he wielded it like a precision instrument. That airline doesn't know what hit them. The honk came again, more insistent. I have to go. Zoe kissed her mother's cheek, breathing in the familiar scent of lavender and antiseptic that always clung to her scrubs. I'll call you when I land. She was halfway to the door when her mother called after her. Zoe, remember what I said about proving people wrong. One day at a time. Today counts as one day. Zoe smiled, the first genuine one of the morning. She walked out into the humid Atlanta air, where the driver was already opening the car door. The NASA packet felt lighter in her hands as she slid into the backseat. Hartsfield-Jackson, she told the driver, settling in for the 40-minute ride to the airport. She had no way of knowing that in 3 hours, she'd need every lesson about proving people wrong that her mother had ever taught her. Flight attendant Richard Bauer was reviewing the first-class passenger manifest when he saw it. Seat 2A, Williams, Zemis. He paused, stylus hovering over his tablet in the crew briefing room at Hartsfield-Jackson's Delta hub. 23 years of commercial aviation had taught him to read passenger lists like weather reports, looking for potential turbulence before it developed. Single initial usually meant business travelers trying to maintain privacy. Miss meant young, possibly inexperienced with first-class protocols. The combination often spelled trouble. Full cabin today? Asked Sarah Chen, adjusting her uniform in the mirror that took up most of one wall of the briefing room. Sarah was newer, 2 years on international routes, still optimistic about passengers and company policy. Richard envied that sometimes. 86%, he replied, scrolling through the list. Most are regulars, few names I don't recognize. The truth was more complicated. Richard did recognize most names, could tell you their drink preferences and seating habits, whether they'd tip well or make unreasonable demands. He took pride in that knowledge. First-class service meant anticipating needs before they were voiced, maintaining standards that separated premium passengers from the chaos of coach. His ex-wife had called it elitism. During their divorce proceedings, she'd accused him of caring more about strangers in expensive suits than his own family. The accusation stung because it held a grain of truth. Richard found order in the first-class cabin that he'd never managed to create at home. Rules made sense at 30,000 feet in ways they never had in suburban Atlanta. Any potential issues? Sarah was reviewing safety protocols on her own tablet, the kind of thoroughness that would serve her well if she lasted in this business. Richard looked back at seat 2A Williams. Something about it bothered him, though he couldn't articulate what. Maybe it was the age marker. Miss instead of Ms. suggested someone very young. He'd seen it before. Teenagers with family money, treating first class like their personal playground, filming everything for social media, disrupting the careful atmosphere that regular passengers paid premium prices to enjoy. Shouldn't be, he said finally. Just need to make sure everyone understands the expectations. They walked through the jet bridge 20 minutes later, Richard carrying the subtle authority that came from years of managing confined spaces filled with demanding personalities. The Airbus A330 was pristine, cleaned and restocked during its Atlanta layover. First class contained 12 seats arranged in a 1-2-1 configuration, each with direct aisle access and enough privacy for business calls or sleep. This was Richard's domain, and he maintained it with the dedication of a curator. Sarah began her pre-flight inspection while Richard reviewed passenger notes. The regular business travelers would board first. He knew their faces, their habits, their preferred newspapers. Then would come the leisure travelers, often less familiar with first-class protocols but usually respectful of the environment they'd paid to enter. "Richard," Sarah's voice carried a note of uncertainty. "Should I be worried about anything specific today?" It was an odd question, but Richard understood it. New flight attendants developed instincts about difficult flights. Sometimes the tension was visible in passenger interactions during boarding. Sometimes it built from crew dynamics or weather delays. Today felt different, though he couldn't explain why. "Just maintain standards," he said, straightening his tie. "Our job is to ensure that passengers who have paid for a premium experience receive one. Sometimes that means having difficult conversations." What he didn't say, what he barely admitted to himself, was that those difficult conversations had become easier over the years. He developed a sense for passengers who didn't belong, who'd somehow gained access to first class without understanding its unwritten rules. Age was often a factor. So was demeanor. So were other things he preferred not to examine too closely. The boarding announcement echoed through the terminal. In 10 minutes, passengers would begin arriving. Richard checked his appearance one final time in the galley's polished steel surface. 23 years of service had taught him that first impressions mattered, that authority came from posture and tone as much as uniform and policy. He thought about seat 2A again as the first passengers appeared in the jet bridge. Z. Williams, Miss. In his experience, passengers like that usually needed guidance about where they belonged. 3 rows back, Maria Santos was trying to decide whether to mind her own business. She'd earned the window seat in 5A through a combination of frequent flyer miles and a credit card that charged more in annual fees than some people spent on groceries. The marketing consulting firm she'd built from her DC apartment now employed 12 people and held contracts with 3 Fortune 500 companies. Success, she'd learned, meant choices about when to engage and when to stay invisible. Today, she'd planned on invisible. The flight to Washington Dulles would give her 2 hours to review client proposals without the constant ping of emails and phone calls. Her laptop was charged, her noise-canceling headphones were ready, and she'd specifically chosen the window seat to avoid conversation with fellow passengers. But something about the energy in the cabin felt off. Maria had been flying first class for 3 years now, long enough to recognize the typical rhythm of boarding. Business travelers claimed their seats with efficient movements, settling in with newspapers or laptops. Leisure travelers took longer, adjusting seat controls and exploring amenities. Flight attendants moved through their pre-flight routine with practiced choreography, checking seatbelts and drink orders. This felt different. The lead flight attendant, his name tag read Richard, kept glancing toward the front of the cabin with an expression Maria couldn't quite read. Not concern exactly, but something more pointed, more personal. She followed his gaze to seat 2A, where a young black woman sat reading what appeared to be an official government document. The woman was clearly a teenager, though she carried herself with unusual composure. Her clothes were expensive but understated. A navy blazer that looked tailored, low heels that suggested business rather than fashion. Everything about her presentation suggested someone comfortable in professional environments. So why did the flight attendant keep staring? Maria had built her career on reading room dynamics, on sensing the undercurrents that determined whether meetings would be productive or confrontational. Right now, her instincts were screaming that something was building. The question was whether it was any of her business. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant. "Client moved Tuesday meeting to 10 a.m. Need the Morrison proposal revised before you land." Maria sighed and opened her laptop. She had work to do, deadlines to meet, her own problems to solve. Whatever drama might unfold in seat 2A wasn't her responsibility. She was a passenger, not a referee. But she didn't put in her headphones, not yet. Instead, she opened her phone's camera app and checked the battery level. Full charge, plenty of storage space. The live stream feature she'd used for client presentations was ready if needed. Just in case minding her own business stopped being an option. The approach was designed to appear routine. Richard waited until the cabin doors were sealed and departure was 15 minutes away. Most passengers had settled into their pre-flight routines, laptops open, phones charging, newspapers unfolded. The timing gave weight to his actions without creating unnecessary delay. He walked to seat 2A with the measured pace he used for all passenger interactions, professional but purposeful. The young woman looked up as he approached, and for a moment Richard felt something unexpected, uncertainty. Her eyes were intelligent and direct, holding his gaze with confidence that seemed beyond her years. "Excuse me, miss?" His voice carried the polite authority perfected over 2 decades of passenger service. "I'm going to need to see your boarding pass." It wasn't an unusual request. Flight attendants checked documents regularly during boarding, ensuring passengers were in correct seats and resolving seating conflicts. The words themselves were standard. But the tone wasn't. Of course, the young woman reached into her blazer pocket and produced a boarding pass printed on heavy stock paper, first class. Seat 2A, her name was printed clearly, Williams, Zoe, miss. Richard examined the document longer than necessary, aware that his prolonged scrutiny was drawing attention from nearby passengers. The boarding pass was legitimate. He could tell from the paper quality and printing format. Delta didn't make mistakes with first-class assignments. Still, something felt wrong. "This is definitely your seat?" he asked, handing back the boarding pass. "Yes, sir." Her response was polite, measured. No defensiveness, no irritation at being questioned. Richard found that almost more troubling than if she'd pushed back. In his experience, passengers who belonged in first class showed a certain familiarity with being questioned about their presence. They had learned to assert their rights through tone and body language. This girl just sat there waiting. "Sometimes passengers get confused about cabin assignments," he continued, the words coming out more pointed than he'd intended. "The gate agents don't always explain the differences clearly." Zoe Williams looked at him steadily. "I'm not confused." "Of course not, it's just that." He paused, searching for language that sounded helpful rather than confrontational. "First class has certain expectations. Passengers who are familiar with the service understand how to fit in." The phrase hung in the air between them. Richard realized he'd crossed a line he hadn't intended to cross, said something that sounded worse spoken aloud than it had in his mind. But backing down now would undermine his authority. "I understand the expectations," Zoe said quietly. She returned her attention to the document in her lap. Richard could see the Federal Eagle seal on the cover, some kind of government paperwork, probably related to whatever program had brought her to first class in the first place. Educational trip, maybe, or family connections that had secured her a premium seat. He stood there for another moment, waiting for something. An explanation, a justification, evidence that would resolve his discomfort. Instead, Zoe Williams simply waited, displaying the kind of patient composure that suggested she'd been through similar interactions before. Richard walked back toward the galley, dissatisfaction settling in his chest like indigestion. The exchange had accomplished nothing except making him look petty in front of other passengers. But the feeling that something was out of place remained, stronger now than before. She wasn't satisfied. "Sarah, can you double-check the passenger list for seat 2A?" Richard kept his voice low, though several first-class passengers were close enough to overhear. The galley provided minimal privacy, just enough space for 2 flight attendants to coordinate service without broadcasting every conversation. Sarah pulled up the tablet and scrolled through the manifest. "Williams Zoe, 17 years old, traveling alone, paid fare, not an upgrade." She looked up. "Is there a problem?" "I'm not sure." Richard glanced back toward seat 2A, where Zoe Williams remained absorbed in her reading. "Something seems off about the booking." It was a lie, and they both knew it. The booking was straightforward, full-fare first-class ticket purchased 3 weeks in advance. No red flags, no irregularities. Sarah's expression suggested she understood the real nature of Richard's concern, even if she wasn't willing to voice it. "She seems fine to me," Sarah said carefully. "Quiet, polite, not bothering anyone." "It's not about bothering anyone." Richard's voice carried an edge of frustration. "It's about maintaining standards. Other passengers pay premium prices for a certain atmosphere." Sarah nodded, but her agreement seemed forced. In the 2 years they'd worked together, Richard had never seen her challenge passenger legitimacy without clear cause. Usually, problems were obvious. Intoxicated passengers, people in wrong seats, travelers who'd somehow gained access to areas they hadn't paid for. This was different, and they both knew it. "What do you want me to do?" Sarah asked. Richard looked back at the cabin. Most passengers had settled into their pre-flight routines, but a few were watching the galley area with obvious curiosity. Extended crew conversations during boarding usually meant problems, and experienced travelers had learned to pay attention to flight attendant behavior. "Let me handle it," he said. "If there's an issue, I'll resolve it before we take off." What he didn't say was that the issue felt personal in a way that professional training hadn't prepared him for. Zoe Williams threatened something about the first-class environment that he couldn't articulate, not through anything she'd done, but through her mere presence. 3 rows back, Maria Santos had put away her laptop. Her Morrison proposal could wait. Instead, she'd opened her phone's camera app and begun recording, though she hadn't yet started live streaming. The footage was insurance, evidence of whatever was building between the lead flight attendant and the teenager in seat 2A. Maria had seen this dynamic before, in boardrooms and conference halls. The subtle exclusion, the questioning of credentials that was really questioning of belonging. She'd experienced it herself often enough to recognize the signs. The difference was that this time, she had a platform to document it. Her Instagram account had 43,000 followers, built through years of business content and behind-the-scenes glimpses of entrepreneurial life. She'd never used it for social justice content, never positioned herself as an activist or advocate. But watching the flight attendant return to seat 2A, she felt something shift. Her thumb hovered over the Go Live button. "Not yet, but soon. Miss Williams, I'm going to need you to come with me." This time, Richard's voice carried enough authority to stop conversations throughout the first-class cabin. Several passengers looked up from their phones and laptops. The businessman in seat 1A lowered his Financial Times. Even the family in row 3 paused their quiet discussion to pay attention. Zoe looked up from her NASA packet. "Is there a problem, sir?" "There might be. I'd like to clear up some questions about your ticket before we depart." It was bureaucratic language, designed to sound official without making specific accusations. Richard had learned the phrasing from dealing with passengers who'd somehow gained access to first class through booking errors or system glitches. Usually, the language alone was enough to prompt explanations or voluntary moves to appropriate seats. Zoe Williams didn't move. "What questions do you have?" she asked. "I think it would be better if we discuss this privately." Richard gestured toward the galley area, "just to avoid any confusion." "I'm not confused." Her voice remained steady, but something in her posture suggested she understood exactly what was happening. "My ticket is valid, my seat assignment is correct, and I haven't violated any airline policies." The response was too precise, too legally informed for a typical 17-year-old. Richard felt his frustration building. Passengers who knew their rights were harder to manage, especially when their rights conflicted with his sense of proper order. "Miss, I'm trying to help you avoid an embarrassing situation." "What situation would that be?" The question hung in the cabin air like a challenge. Richard realized he'd been maneuvered into a position where his next words would have to be either an explicit accusation or a complete retreat. The teenager in seat 2A had somehow forced him to articulate his concerns directly. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "passengers find themselves in seats they didn't actually purchase. Booking errors, system glitches, that kind of thing. It's easier to resolve these issues on the ground than in the air." "My boarding pass shows seat 2A, Zoe said. "The reservation system shows seat 2A. Are you suggesting there's been an error?" "I'm suggesting that passengers like you sometimes get confused about which cabin they're supposed to be in." The words came out louder than he'd intended, carrying across the first-class cabin with unmistakable clarity. Richard immediately regretted the phrasing, but retreat was impossible now. He'd committed to a confrontation that had to be resolved one way or another. Zoe Williams looked at him with an expression that seemed decades older than 17. "Passengers like me," she repeated quietly. He checked his watch, not to see the time. Captain Morrison, we have a situation in first class. Richard's radio call brought immediate response from the cockpit, though the captain's voice carried the weary tone of someone accustomed to pre-flight passenger issues. 12 minutes to departure meant whatever was happening needed resolution fast, before air traffic control assigned them a new departure slot. What kind of situation? Morrison's voice crackled through the cabin intercom system, audible to passengers who'd stopped pretending not to listen to the confrontation developing in seat 2A. Passenger legitimacy question, might need security. The phrase was coded language that experienced flight crews understood. Not a safety threat, not an unruly passenger, but someone whose right to be aboard required verification. The kind of situation that airlines handled quietly to avoid complications or negative publicity. 3 rows back, Maria Santos had made her decision. She opened Instagram Live and watched the viewer count climb from 0 to 37 in the first 10 seconds. Her followers were accustomed to business content posted during normal East Coast hours, not live streams from airplane cabins at departure time. "I'm on a flight from Atlanta to DC," she said quietly into her phone's camera. "Something's happening up in first class that I think people need to see." The viewer count jumped to 93. Maria adjusted her angle to capture seat 2A, where Zoe Williams remained motionless while the flight attendant stood over her with obvious hostility. The teenager's composure was remarkable. No visible anger, no defensive body language, just patient waiting. "Flight attendant has been harassing this young black woman for the past 10 minutes, Maria continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "Questioning her ticket, suggesting she doesn't belong in first class. She hasn't done anything wrong." 200 viewers, then 400. The comment section began scrolling rapidly. "Record everything. What airline is this? Call them out. This is disgusting." Captain Morrison emerged from the cockpit looking like a man who'd rather be dealing with mechanical problems than passenger relations. 48 years old, silver-haired, carrying the confident authority that came from 22 years of commercial aviation and Air Force training before that. He approached seat 2A with the measured pace of someone accustomed to diffusing tension. "Miss, I'm Captain Morrison. Richard here says there might be some confusion about your seating assignment." Morrison's tone was professional but not hostile, suggesting he might take a different approach than his flight attendant. Richard stood beside him, tablet in hand, ready to present whatever evidence he'd assembled to support his concerns. Zoe looked up at the captain with the same steady gaze she'd given Richard. "No confusion, Captain. I have a confirmed first-class ticket for seat 2A. I haven't violated any policies or caused any disturbances. May I see your boarding pass and identification?" The request was reasonable, though Maria noticed that no other first-class passengers had been asked for identification verification. Her viewer count had passed 800, with comments streaming too fast to read individual messages. Zoe produced her boarding pass and driver's license. Morrison examined both documents carefully, comparing the photo to the young woman in front of him. Georgia driver's license, clear photo match, birthday confirming she was indeed 17 years old. "Everything appears to be in order," Morrison said after a long moment. Richard stepped forward. "Captain, I still think." 8 minutes to departure, the gate agent's voice announced over the intercom, cutting through Richard's objection. "All passengers should be seated with seatbelts fastened." Morrison looked around the cabin, taking in the dozen passengers who were openly watching the confrontation. Experienced travelers, business people, the kind of customers who generated complaints to corporate headquarters when flights departed late or service fell below expectations. "Richard, let's discuss this privately." But Richard's radio was already crackling with another voice, someone from ground operations, though the transmission was partially garbled by static. "Captain Morrison, please respond. We have corporate on line 1 requesting immediate contact about passenger services issue on your aircraft." Morrison's expression shifted from irritation to concern. Corporate didn't monitor individual flights unless something had escalated beyond normal crew authority. His eyes moved from Richard to Zoe Williams to the passengers throughout first class, several of whom were now holding up phones. How would corporate know about a passenger services issue? He asked quietly. Maria Santos raised her phone slightly higher, ensuring her camera captured Morrison's face as he realized the situation had already moved beyond the aircraft. Her viewer count had passed 1,500. The ground was shifting. Morrison keyed his radio with the reluctance of a man who suspected the conversation would complicate his Monday morning beyond repair. Ground operations, this is Captain Morrison responding. Captain, patch through to corporate immediately. We have executive leadership requesting information about a passenger incident on your aircraft. The phrase executive leadership carried weight that every airline employee understood. Not customer service, not regional management, but the level of corporate authority that became involved when situations threatened company reputation or legal exposure. Morrison looked at his watch. 6 minutes to departure. Air traffic control would want an explanation if they requested a delay, and explanations would require paperwork that could ground the aircraft for hours. Richard, return to your station and prepare for departure, Morrison ordered. Miss Williams, thank you for your patience with our security procedures. It was a diplomatic retreat, phrased to suggest that Richard's actions had been routine security protocols rather than personal harassment. But the damage was already visible. Other passengers were exchanging glances, some still recording with their phones. The carefully controlled first-class atmosphere that Richard prized had been shattered by a confrontation that never should have occurred. Richard remained standing beside seat 2A, his face flushed with something between anger and embarrassment. Captain, I really think we should verify. Morrison's radio crackled again, this time with a voice that carried unmistakable authority. Captain Morrison, this is Janet Walsh, VP of Customer Relations. Please confirm the status of passenger Williams in seat 2A. The use of Zoe's name stopped all conversation in the first-class cabin. Corporate executives didn't know passenger names unless those passengers had connections that reached far above normal customer service channels. Morrison stared at his radio, as if it had delivered news of mechanical failure. Ma'am, passenger Williams is seated and ready for departure. No issues at this time. Understood. Please ensure that Ms. Williams receives our full first-class service standards, and have your lead flight attendant contact me immediately upon arrival in Washington. The transmission ended, leaving Morrison standing in an aircraft cabin that had gone completely silent. Maria Santos watched her viewer count explode past 5,000 as she whispered into her phone. Corporate just called the captain by name about this passenger. Someone very powerful is making phone calls. The comments section was moving too fast to read. Who is she? This is insane. Far about to get fired. Record everything. What is happening? Zoe Williams sat motionless in seat 2A, her NASA packet still open in her lap. For the first time since the confrontation began, she allowed herself a small smile. Not satisfaction, something older than that. Richard Bauer felt it before he understood it. The ground was shifting. The leather folder slipped from Richard's fingers, landing with a soft thud on the cabin floor. Inside, visible through the clear plastic window, was a business card with elegant embossed lettering. Dr. Zoe Williams, board member, Federal Aviation Administration Advisory Committee. Not an employee, not a consultant, a board member. Richard's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He bent to retrieve the folder, his movements mechanical, disconnected from the calculations racing through his mind. Advisory committee positions were appointed directly by the Secretary of Transportation. They required security clearances that took months to obtain. They meant access to regulatory decisions that could ground aircraft, change industry standards, determine which airlines received federal contracts worth hundreds of millions. I was just ensuring passenger safety, he said, his voice carrying less conviction than before. It's standard protocol to verify documentation in first class. Zoe's fingers drummed once against her armrest. A small gesture, barely perceptible, but somehow it contained multitudes of patience worn thin by repetition. Of course, she said simply, I understand protocols. Morrison shifted his weight from one foot to the other, glancing between Richard and the radio in his hand. Corporate executives didn't memorize passenger names unless those passengers had influence that extended far beyond normal customer service channels. And Janet Walsh hadn't just called about passenger satisfaction. She'd called about Zoe Williams specifically, by name, with the kind of urgency that suggested phone calls had been made at levels Morrison couldn't even imagine. Richard straightened slowly, the folder extended toward Zoe with hands that weren't entirely steady. His mind was working through connections, implications, the growing understanding that this situation had escalated beyond anything he could control through usual flight attendant authority. The cabin settled into silence. Captain Morrison's radio remained quiet. The overhead storage compartments hummed with their usual mechanical persistence. Somewhere in row 7, a child coughed softly into their parent's shoulder. Maria Santos held her phone steady, watching her viewer count climb past 8,000 as she whispered barely audible commentary into her microphone. The silence itself had become content, pregnant with the understanding that something fundamental had shifted in the power dynamics of the aircraft cabin. Then Morrison's radio crackled with a different voice entirely. "Captain Morrison, this is Secretary Patricia Hamilton from the Department of Transportation. Please confirm that Dr. Zoe Williams, chair of our Aviation Safety Review Board, has been accommodated appropriately during her travel to the Emergency Oversight Committee meeting scheduled for this morning." The word chair landed in the cabin like a physical object. Not board member, chair. The Aviation Safety Review Board was the federal body responsible for investigating discrimination complaints, safety violations, and operational standards across all commercial airlines. The chair position wasn't just influential, it was regulatory. It meant the authority to recommend license suspensions, fine airlines into bankruptcy, or mandate industry-wide policy changes that could reshape commercial aviation. And Richard Bauer had just spent 15 minutes demanding that its chair prove she belonged in first class. Morrison stared at the radio as if it had announced mechanical failure in both engines. His voice, when he managed to find it, carried the careful precision of a man walking across thin ice. "Secretary Hamilton, Dr. Williams has been accommodated. We are preparing for on-time departure." "Excellent. Please ensure that Dr. Williams receives a full briefing on any operational irregularities during today's flight. Her committee will be reviewing passenger service protocols as part of the emergency session, and first-hand experience with airline service standards will be valuable for her testimony." The transmission ended. Richard's face drained of color from his forehead downward, the change visible even in the dim cabin lighting. His hands trembling slightly as the full scope of his situation began to crystallize. The silence felt like a physical weight, pressing against every passenger in first class as they absorbed the implications of what they had just witnessed. Maria Santos watched her viewer count explode past 12,000, the comments section moving too fast for human eyes to follow as thousands of people processed the revelation in real time. Her whispered commentary had stopped entirely. Sometimes, she understood, the story told itself. And that's when Richard Bauer finally understood, not just what he had done to. The collapse wasn't immediate. Richard's training, 15 years of customer service protocols and conflict de-escalation, provided him with one final attempt at professional recovery. "Dr. Williams, I do apologize for any inconvenience. Sometimes our security procedures can seem excessive, but I'm sure you understand that we have to maintain consistent standards for all passengers." His voice carried forced steadiness, the tone of a man trying to reframe a catastrophe as a minor misunderstanding. "Perhaps I could arrange for some complimentary champagne to make up for the delay." The offer hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished fire. Zoe closed her NASA packet with deliberate care, each movement precise and unhurried. When she looked up at Richard, her expression contained no anger, no satisfaction, no triumph, just a familiar exhaustion that seemed to age her beyond her years. "That won't be necessary," she said quietly. But the cabin had already begun its silent judgment of everything that had transpired. The man in seat 1C, who had nodded approvingly when Richard first approached Zoe, now studied his phone screen with intense concentration, his jaw tight with the discomfort of realizing he had publicly supported something he could no longer defend. His earlier comment about finally seeing some standards echoed in his memory like an accusation. The woman in 3A, who had whispered to her companion about it being about time someone checked these people, clutched her designer handbag against her chest, the leather strap cutting into her palm as she gripped it with white knuckles. She had not spoken loudly enough for the phones to record, but her own conscience played back every approving glance, every subtle nod of encouragement she had given Richard during his interrogation. The businessman in 2C, who had made a point of looking annoyed by the disruption to his pre-flight routine, discovered that his laptop screen had gone dark, forgotten, as he stared at his reflection in the black surface and wondered what his silence had made him complicit in. These were the passengers who had not protested, had not intervened, had not questioned. They had simply watched, and in watching without objection, had become part of the machinery of humiliation that Richard had constructed around Zoe Williams. Now they sat with the understanding that their passive participation had been recorded, broadcast, witnessed by thousands of people who would judge not just Richard's actions, but their own inaction. For Zoe, the revelation of her identity brought no sense of vindication. She had been in this position before, too many times to count. The assumption that she didn't belong, followed by the grudging retreat when her credentials proved impossible to dismiss, followed by the awkward attempts to reframe discrimination as miscommunication. It was a cycle she had navigated since her first day as an engineering student, through her years at NASA, through every airport security line and hotel check-in and restaurant reservation that required her to prove she had earned her place in spaces that questioned her presence. This wasn't victory, this was just another Tuesday. The weight of witness fell heaviest on those who had chosen comfort over courage, silence over solidarity. In the carefully controlled environment of first class, where every service was designed to insulate passengers from discomfort, they had been confronted with a discomfort that no amount of premium pricing could eliminate. The recognition of their own moral cowardice, broadcast live to an audience that would not forget. By the time Flight 447 touched down at Ronald Reagan Washington National Airport, the financial reckoning had already begun. United Airlines' stock price had dropped 4% in the 2 hours since Maria Santos's live stream began trending across social media platforms. 4% of a company valued at $47 billion, $1,800 million in market capitalization, gone. Enough to fund every employee in that first-class cabin's salary for 3 lifetimes. Vanished in the time it took one flight attendant to demand that one passenger justify her existence. The numbers painted a stark picture of institutional failure. Richard's 15-minute interrogation of Dr. Williams had generated 1,743 discrimination complaints filed against United Airlines before the aircraft reached cruising altitude. Not new incidents. These were existing complaints that passengers had been reluctant to file until they watched someone else's humiliation broadcast in real time. Stories of their own encounters with airline staff who had assumed they didn't belong, questioned their tickets, demanded additional identification, or treated them as threats rather than customers. The Federal Aviation Administration announced a comprehensive audit of passenger service protocols across all major carriers within 6 hours of the video going viral. The audit would cost the airline industry an estimated $230 million to complete. $230 million that would come directly from profit margins, shareholder dividends, and executive bonuses. The financial weight of 15 minutes of recorded bigotry translated into corporate accountability. United Airlines retained Krensky and Associates, the crisis management firm that specialized in reputation rehabilitation for companies facing discrimination lawsuits, at a cost of $4.7 million for a 6-month engagement. $4.7 million to craft carefully worded apologies, sensitivity training programs, and diversity initiatives designed to convince the public that Richard Bauer's actions were an aberration rather than a symptom of institutional culture. Richard himself faced immediate termination, forfeiture of his pension benefits, and a personal lawsuit filed by Dr. Williams seeking $2.3 million in damages for intentional infliction of emotional distress and civil rights violations. His union initially indicated they would provide legal representation, then reversed course when the full scope of the video evidence became clear. 15 years of service, a previously clean employment record, and annual performance reviews that consistently rated him as professional and courteous. all rendered irrelevant by 17 minutes of recorded interaction. Maria Santos's livestream had been viewed 14.7 million times across all platforms by the time the aircraft reached its gate. 14.7 million people had watched a real-time demonstration of how institutional discrimination operated, how it was normalized, how it was enabled by the silence of bystanders who chose comfort over conscience. The video became a case study, referenced in diversity training programs, congressional hearings, and federal court decisions that would reshape passenger rights legislation. The mathematics of accountability were precise, unforgiving, and entirely public. The emergency board meeting convened in United Airlines Chicago headquarters at 11 p.m. Eastern Time, 6 hours ahead of the regularly scheduled session. The conference room on the 42nd floor typically hosted quarterly earnings calls and strategic planning sessions. Tonight, it contained 12 executives whose combined salaries exceeded the gross domestic product of small nations, assembled to address a crisis that had originated in 17 minutes of first-class cabin interaction. Chairman Michael Davidson had been pulled from his daughter's wedding reception in Connecticut. CFO Patricia Wong had canceled a presentation to international investors that had been scheduled for months. VP of Human Resources David Chen had been on vacation in Hawaii with his family, his first time away from work in 18 months. The mood in the room carried the particular tension of powerful people confronting a problem that money and influence could not immediately solve. Social media had democratized accountability in ways that traditional corporate crisis management had not adapted to address. There was no amount of advertising spending that could compete with 14.7 million people who had watched discrimination happen in real time. Effective immediately, all passenger service staff will be equipped with body cameras during their shifts, Davidson announced, his voice carrying the exhaustion of a man who had aged 5 years in one evening. Every interaction with passengers will be recorded, reviewed, and evaluated for compliance with our new zero-tolerance discrimination policy. Zero tolerance meant immediate termination for any employee who engaged in behavior similar to Richard's. No warnings, no retraining, no second chances. The policy would cost approximately $60 million annually to implement across United's 23,000 flight attendants, gate agents, and customer service representatives. Within 48 hours, Delta, American, and Southwest Airlines had released nearly identical policy statements. The industry understood that United's crisis had become aviation's crisis. No carrier could afford to appear less committed to passenger equality than their competitors. The regulatory environment had shifted overnight, with federal oversight committees now actively monitoring social media for evidence of discriminatory practices. Dr. Zoe Williams was invited to provide testimony at 3 congressional hearings, appear on 7 major news programs, and address the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People's annual convention. She declined all media appearances, but agreed to chair a federal task force on transportation equity, a position that would allow her to translate one morning's humiliation into systemic policy change. The task force would have regulatory authority to investigate discrimination complaints, mandate training programs, and impose financial penalties on transportation companies that failed to meet federal equality standards. It was influence that extended far beyond airline passenger service, into bus systems, train networks, taxi regulations, and ride-sharing oversight. 6 months after Flight 447 landed in Washington, Maria Santos still received messages from viewers who had been inspired by her decision to record and broadcast Richard's interrogation of Dr. Williams. Her follower count had grown from 3,000 to 247,000, transforming her from a casual travel blogger into an influential voice for passenger rights advocacy. But the growth hadn't brought satisfaction. Maria found herself unable to shake the memory of the first few minutes of Richard's approach to Dr. Williams, when she had been more focused on her own travel delays than on what was happening in Seat 2A. She remembered thinking that the interaction was probably routine, that she shouldn't get involved in airline business, that recording might be an invasion of privacy. Her phone had been in her hand, but she had hesitated. Those moments of hesitation haunted her more than any of the praise she had received for eventually pressing record. She had learned that courage wasn't the absence of uncertainty, It was the decision to act in spite of it. The difference between intervention and complicity often came down to seconds, to the choice between personal comfort and collective responsibility. She still flew United Airlines when their flights offered the best routes or prices. But she always kept her phone charged, recording app readily accessible, conscious that witnessing injustice created an obligation that extended beyond personal convenience. Ladies and gentlemen, what you witnessed today was not extraordinary. That's the point. The system that allowed Richard Bauer to spend 17 minutes questioning Dr. Zoe Williams's right to occupy seat 2A operates on assumptions so deeply embedded in our social infrastructure that we rarely examine them directly. Assumptions about who belongs in spaces of privilege, who deserves the benefit of doubt, and whose presence requires explanation or justification. These assumptions function as invisible machinery, grinding away at human dignity with such consistency that we mistake their operation for normalcy. The passengers in that first-class cabin who nodded approvingly, whispered encouragement, or simply remained silent were not actively malicious. They were participating in a collective understanding about social hierarchy that felt natural, comfortable, unquestionable, until the moment it was revealed to be wrong, until the machinery of assumption collided with the reality of Dr. Williams's actual identity and authority. But here's the question that matters. What would you have done? In those first few minutes, before corporate executives started making phone calls, before the reveals and reversals and recorded evidence of discrimination, what would you have done when you saw another human being required to justify their existence? Maria Santos wasn't the only person in that cabin with a phone. She wasn't the only one who could have spoken up, asked questions, or simply offered solidarity to someone being humiliated in public. The difference between Maria and everyone else wasn't courage. It was the decision to stop waiting for someone else to act first. 1 year later, the changes initiated by 17 minutes of recorded discrimination had become permanent fixtures of airline industry regulation. The Federal Aviation Administration's Passenger Rights Enforcement Division, created in direct response to the Williams incident, had investigated over 3,000 discrimination complaints and imposed $47 million in fines against airlines that failed to meet federal equality standards. United Airlines' diversity training program, developed with oversight from Dr. Williams's federal task force, had been adopted by 6 other major carriers and become the industry standard for passenger service education. The program included mandatory viewing of Maria Santos's video as part of core curriculum, ensuring that every airline employee understood the personal and institutional consequences of discriminatory behavior. Richard Bauer's termination had been upheld through every level of appeal, including federal court review. His case became legal precedent for employment discrimination law, establishing that customer-facing employees could be held personally liable for civil rights violations committed during their official duties. But the most significant change was quieter, harder to quantify in corporate reports or federal statistics. Dr. Zoe Williams had continued her work with NASA, her research into spacecraft navigation systems, her service on federal aviation committees. She traveled frequently for conferences, meetings, and speaking engagements. Last Thursday, she boarded a flight from Houston to Atlanta. First class, seat 2A, the flight attendant checked her boarding pass, welcomed her aboard, and asked if she would prefer champagne or orange juice before departure. Nobody asked her twice. The conversation in that aircraft cabin and in thousands of others since had shifted. Not completely, not permanently, but measurably. The invisible machinery of assumption continued to operate, but it no longer operated without witnesses, without accountability, without the possibility that someone might be recording. Have you ever witnessed something like this and wished you'd said something? Tell me in the comments below. Not because I want to hear about discrimination, because I want to hear about the moments when you chose to act, when you decided that someone else's dignity mattered more than your own comfort. Those are the stories that change how we treat each other. If you believe that the stories that make the most difference are the ones nobody's talking about, this channel is for you. We don't chase viral moments or manufacture outrage. We examine the quiet systems that shape how we interact, how we judge, how we decide who deserves respect and who has to earn it. Subscribe if you want to be part of changing those conversations. Tag someone who needs to see this. not to make them angry, not to generate arguments about politics or race or airline policies. Tag them to remind them what quiet power looks like. The power to witness, to record, to speak up when speaking up costs something. The power to recognize that individual moments of courage can become systemic change, but only if enough individuals decide to be courageous at the same time. The machinery of assumption is powerful, persistent, and profitable for those who benefit from its operation. But it's not invincible. It just requires more people like Maria Santos, who decided that 17 minutes of discomfort with recording was preferable to a lifetime of regret about staying silent. It requires more people willing to examine their own assumptions, challenge their own comfort, and act when action is needed rather than when action is convenient. The next time you see someone being questioned about whether they belong somewhere, remember Dr. Williams in Seat 2A. Remember that dignity doesn't require credentials. That respect shouldn't have to be earned through explanation, and that your silence is never as neutral as it feels. Remember that the person being questioned might be someone whose work protects your safety, advances human knowledge, or shapes the policies that govern your own life. But most importantly, remember that they don't have to be any of those things to deserve basic human decency. Your phone has a camera. Your voice can ask questions. Your presence can shift the balance of power in any room, on any aircraft, in any moment when someone needs an ally more than they need your comfort. The question isn't whether you'll encounter these situations. The question is what you'll do when you do.